What is the grand narrative of the entire Bible? Let me rephrase that. If someone said, let's just focus on the Hebrew Scriptures right now, the Old Testament. Let's say, if someone said, what's the big overarching story? What would you say? How would you answer that question? And is there one? I think when most people read the Bible, they see it as a collection of sort of disparate stories. They're not really wrong. You see, the Bible is 66 books, 39 in the Old Testament and 27 in the New, with 40 plus authors, depending who you ask. And it was written over 1,000 plus years. And story. There isn't one person who sat down and wrote the Bible front to back and said, this is what I'm trying to say. It was a bunch of people, 40 plus of them, saying over 1,000 plus years, this is what we think God is. And this is how we think He interacts with us. And yet, these books are not isolated, random texts. Individually, yes, they are 66 books written by 40 plus people over 1,000 years, but they tell a single story. They come at it from different angles and different perspectives, and once in a while there's little rabbit trails, I'll give you that, but there is what we call a grand narrative. What is it? What is it? Well, last week I laid 2,000 years of atonement theory at your feet. I hope you're recovered from that. More than a few people said they're going to have to go back and watch the video just to try to take it all in. And I wouldn't blame you. You have to remember that it took me 15 hours to put together that 40 minutes of talking, okay? I might have to go back and watch my own video to remember what I said. Today, we talked about the last 2,000 years. Or last week, we talked about the last 2,000 years. Today, I want to go back before that. I want to do something similar, but I want to move backwards in time and pick up the story at the beginning of creation and work our way up to Jesus in the first century. Now, why would I want to do that? The other day, I was talking to my son Paxton about an upcoming trip that we're going on. Paxton is 6, and he has a lot of questions. The first thing he says to me in the morning is a question, and he asks them all day, and the last thing he says is another question, mostly, do I really have to go to bed? And we were talking about going to Grandma's. Grandma and Grandpa live in New Brunswick, and we're leaving Easter Sunday. We're going to have the car packed up. I pronounce the benediction, politely shake some hands, have a cup of coffee, and then we're headed off to Cornwall. And we're really looking forward to it, and so is my 6-year-old son, Paxton. And he said, Dad, how long is this trip going to take? And I said, well, it's about 16 hours. And he said, is that less or more than driving to Barrie? And I said more, like a lot more. Well, how much more? And he wouldn't let it go. So I finally thought, okay, I got to beat this kid at his game. I pulled up Google Maps. And I said, okay, here's the directions from our house in Victoria Harbor to Centerville, New Brunswick. You see this line? Okay, so well, this is how we're going. And I zoomed way, 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 and I said, see this here? This is the trip to Barrie. And he went, oh, that's a little bit more. You know, there's something about perspective. When you step back and you look at the whole picture, you get perspective that you never otherwise would get. And interestingly, the cool thing is when you've gained the big picture, suddenly those small details, they come into sharpness. They come into focus. Those small details somehow are better understood and better seen in light of the big picture. So today, I want to give you the big picture. I'd like to talk about Israel and Jesus. The Bible begins with perhaps the most famous story in all of the Old Testament, and of course, that's Adam and Eve. I'm sure you know the story. God said, you can have anything you want, eat anything. Just name the animals, take care of my garden, eat anything you want, have at it, but just don't eat of this one tree. This one tree, it will cause so much trouble in your life. You don't know anything about evil. That's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. All you know is good. Don't eat from that tree. Trust me, God says. The serpent slides in and says, did God really say that? Do you think it's going to be that bad? What if we just take a bite? Well, of course, they take a bite. Their eyes are open. Instantly, they feel shame. If you want to know more about this, I did a sermon on this topic on shame in February. They felt shame. God. They just go running when they hear him walking. And of course, that's a metaphor for what sin does in our lives, right? When sin enters into our lives, we feel shame. When God comes walking, we go hiding. We don't want to be in his presence. And then God says to God's self, if we now let them eat from the tree of eternal life, right, that life tree, then they will be stuck in this sorry state forever. And we need some time to fix this. So they exile Adam and Eve. They're booted out of the Garden of Eden. Exile is the most often repeated theme in the Old Testament. And it doesn't stop with Adam and Eve. You probably know some of the more notable exiles, the Assyrian, the Babylonian, of course, the people of God in Egypt, right? But the Old Testament is just shot through with story after story of exile. I don't know if you remember this story from the Old Testament when Abraham runs to famine. There's no food. He goes there. And what happens? Well, it turns out that old Abe's wife, Sarah's pretty hot. And he's really worried about what will happen to him. Because, you know, if she's a widow, she's ripe for the plucking. And he just knows his life might be in danger. So he says, well, you know, it's not my wife. Pharaoh takes her as his wife. Bad things start to happen to Pharaoh. Pharaoh figures out he's being punished by God, and then all is well that ends well. But for a brief period of time, they are stuck in Egypt. Things don't go well for them. Do you remember the story about Jacob when he has to flee his angry brother? For 14 years, he ran and he hid in exile, a self-imposed exile. You know Joseph and his amazing Technicolor dream coat, right? Thrown in a well, sold into slavery, imprisoned, and then forced into captivity. Joseph's story is very well known. Jacob's family, they go to Egypt again to escape a famine. And what happens to Jacob's family in Egypt for 400 years? But they are captives, slaves. They are exiles. The guy Moses comes along. You may have heard of him, kind of a famous dude. And Moses frees Israel, splits the sea. They walk to freedom. They get to the other side. The sea closes back up. And God says, I've got a promised land for you, just waiting for you. But the people of God, they just weren't ready. In their hearts, they weren't ready for it. So they wandered for 40 years in the desert before they even got to the promised land. But finally, they enter the promised land. And everything's great, right? This is the last chapter of the Old Testament, am I wrong? They live happily ever after. Actually, no. This is not the end of the story. Joshua 3 is not the end of the Old Testament. You see, once they're in the promised land, they struggle for survival and independence. They struggle. Things aren't everything they'd hoped they would be in this promised land. So they say to God, God, we need in our kingdom to establish a just rule enemies. And so God said, David is chief among them, but even he at some point has to flee a rebellion of his own. Not too long after David, there's a division of north and the south. The kingdom of Israel is split, and it doesn't take very long. And they both set up their own kings in the north and in the south. And what does this do to the nation of Israel? It weakens it. And Assyria in the north looks down and it says, you know, I think I'll take that. And they invade the northern capital, part of the land. And around 597 BC, Babylonia sees the same opportunity. And they march down. And eventually, after some time, they take the south. And what do? They take the best and the brightest, they take the strongest and the most healthy, and they import them back to Babylon as slaves. That's what they did. For some time, for many, many years, they were in captivity, in exile. Read in Ezra 1, they returned to the promised land once again. And there was a difficult road that lay ahead of them, but eventually they rebuilt the temple which had been torn down. And the people returned from exile. But here's the strange thing. They rebuilt the temple. They returned to their land from exile. And yet, the strangest thing is that rarely did they ever independence. And they would continue to tell and retell their story as one of continuing slavery. Even as they lived in the promised land. Even as they worshiped in their own temple. You see, ever since they were booted from the Garden of Eden, they were always looking for a promised land, and they never, ever quite felt at home. Not even when they got there. And I think if you could sum up the Hebrew Scriptures, you might call it exile, the search for home. After all, their story really begins with this promise from God to Abraham. Now the Lord said to Abraham, go out from your country, your relatives, and your father's household to the land that I will show you. And I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, in order that you might be a prime example of divine blessing, and all the families of the earth will pronounce blessings on one another using your name. They never really found that country. They never really, in one way or another, they were always in some sort of process of exile. And from what I can tell, even to this day, the children of Abraham are still telling and retelling their story as they look to become a great nation with an uncontested promised land that they can call their home. It seems to me that even today, God's chosen people are still looking for that safe and secure promised land. It is absolutely imperative to understand this overarching read the Old Testament, or nothing they do really makes sense. A lot of new people to the faith start reading in the book of Genesis, right? And they start working their way through, and they get really confused and really frustrated. And I'm like, man, of course, this book was written 3,000 years ago. If people lived in very different situations, and you have absolutely no perspective on what you're reading, how could you possibly understand it? I know I didn't. I know I still struggle to understand it. But when you take a step back, when you look at that full Google Maps, the details come into focus. The allegory of Adam and Eve in the exile, the meaning of the Passover supper, even the temple itself with the presence of God that dwelt within the holiest of holies. They are a people in exile, searching for the presence of God in a promised land that they never truly find. The Old Testament doesn't end in victory. But if you were to categorize it, it might be for the people of Israel. You have to understand, exile is a walking death. It's life, but it's not life. They weren't permitted in the garden to eat from that tree of life, right? They ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They knew good, they knew evil. They didn't have life. Moved from that tree, it was a walking death. Here's what God said. The man has now become like one of us, knowing both good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live. Exile is a walking death. But unlike modern Christians who long for a promised land in the sky after death, the Hebrew people, no, they didn't look for a promised land in the sky. They looked for a real physical place where they were safe and they were alone by other nations to worship God and go about their business in the way that they wanted to go about their own business. Which sounds pretty good to me, if I'm honest. The only problem is that Israel struggled to uphold their part of the agreement. Check this out. Moses went up to God, and the Lord called him from the mountain, and he said, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, what you're to tell the people of Israel." Okay, so this is after they've been rescued from slavery, they've been brought out of exile, and they've been given a vision of a promised land. This is what I want you to say to them, Moses. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. This is a covenant. A covenant is a fancy way of saying an agreement. It's a little more serious, I'll say, than a handshake, but it's an agreement nonetheless. I want to break it down for you just a little bit. First of all, God says, you know how I carried you like on eagle's wings, how I brought you out of Egypt, right? Brought you to myself. I want more for you. That was just a taste, a foretaste of what is to come. You need to obey me fully and keep my covenant. All right, so very simple. This goes back to the Garden of Eden. Have anything you want. All this good stuff I've given to you, but there's some bad stuff I need you to avoid. Obey me, God says. Why? What? Because God is capricious? Because God just enjoys telling people what to do? No, because he knows the bad stuff they need to avoid. Just I'll show you the right way. Just obey me and keep my covenant. Keep this agreement. If you do, you will be my treasured possession. I don't know about you, but have you ever had high school? Like, but when I was in high school, you could call them chicks. And it wasn't derogatory. Don't do it today. They don't like it. Did that crush ever look at you the same way? If you've ever looks at you the same way, then you are a blessed person, because there is no feeling in the world than when your crush looks at you and you realize they have a crush on you too. You feel like they're treasured possession. I remember when I told my current wife, like, honey, I didn't call her honey. I said, listen, I know we're friends, but I kind of want to go further than friends. And I thought that was the end of the friendship. I was laying it all on the line. Explanation that she felt the same way. And she looked at me and she said that because I feel the same way. And my heart just leapt for joy. And when she looks at me, sometimes I just know that I am her treasured possession. I can see it in her eyes. This is what God is saying to the people of Israel. You will be my treasured possession. I will love you in ways that you have no understanding. I will sacrifice for you. I will give to you. I will take care of you. I will love you. You will be my treasure, God says. He continues, the whole earth is mine. I could pick anybody, but you're the girl for me, God says. The whole earth is mine, but I have a plan for you. You will be for me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. Now let me ask you, what are priests supposed to do? What is the purpose of a priest? The purpose of a priest is to bring people to God. Teach them this is who God is. This is how God calls us to walk. This is the covenants. And eventually in the Old Testament, in the temple, the priest would be the one who would perform that sacrifice on your behalf, the atonement for sin. You will be for me a kingdom of priests. You will be a holy nation. That's another way of saying they will be set aside for a beautiful, grand God purpose. You will be a holy nation. There's so much going on here. But the thrust of it is that they are set aside for a purpose, and that is to tell the whole world who God is and to invite them into this relationship that they now enjoy. I am calling you as a treasured possession, and I want you to tell the whole world that they too can be my treasured possession. It just starts with you. Well, of course, like Adam and Eve, they struggle to do two things. One is obey, and the other is to fulfill their vocation. Instead of going into the world to tell the world about God, what did they do? They circled the wagons. They became insular. They said, we're having a hard time obeying you, God, and if these pagans out here wouldn't come in and tempt us with their pagan ways, we'd be okay. So let's just push the rest of the world out. So, in their attempt for a personal piety, they actually missed the whole point of that relationship with God in the first place. And I think that's one of the reasons why, even when they lived in their own land, they still experienced this sense of exile, walking death. Now, all of this have to do with the cross. What does all of this have to do with atonement? When the early Christians wrote about Jesus' death, they used what are often seen as different models to describe Jesus' death and what he did. So they talked about redemption, which was a metaphor from the slave market, or justification, which was language that came out of the law court. They talked about sacrifice, which is a metaphor that would have been well known, of course, in the temple. As noted last Sunday, this language can lead us down different pathways of understanding the cross. Here's the thing. These were different ways of talking about the same thing. Different language, different metaphors, but all talking about the same thing. Don't forget that Jesus saw the cross, and he talked about the cross as a fulfillment of the grand narrative known as the Hebrew Scriptures. Do you remember after his resurrection, when he was following these guys on the Emmaus Road, and they're talking about Jesus, how he'd been crucified, how he died, how this great sort of swelling inflated and was gone? He said to them, "Foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. He saw the cross as the culmination of that of exile, the search for home. You see, Abraham and Sarah were meant to be the new Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve, they couldn't obey, they couldn't get it right. Maybe Abraham and Sarah can start a new family that will be obedient and they'll get it right. But it didn't work. It was an opportunity to start over again. It was a failed experiment. The promised land was meant to be the new Garden of Eden, a place where people would find life in the promised land. But what is life in the Garden of Eden? What is the source of all life in the garden? It's not really a tree, is it? Not really. It's a metaphor for something else. The Garden of Eden is the very presence of God. The relationship that God has always had with God's self, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit for all eternity, being invited into this relationship, well, that's the source of life. Eternal life. Now, this promised land was meant to be the new Garden of Eden in three ways. It was meant to be a place of life. Okay? It was meant to be a place of life as opposed to death. While Adam and Eve were barred from the tree of life, and the promised land was going to restore that, as we've talked about. Number two, it was a place of divine presence. When they built that temple, furthest room in the heart of the temple, there was a small room. They called it the holiest of holies. And do you know what was in that room? Nothing. But the presence of God. The presence of God, the sheer magnitude of who God is, was said to dwell in that room. That was the source of life in the temple, in the promised land. And the promised land was meant to be an advanced signpost. It was meant to be a hint of something that was to come. Something was just being hinted at here through this promised land. And they wanted to go back, but not quite back to the Garden of Eden. God had bigger plans than that. This isn't just original creation that they're looking for, that God's looking for, but a recreation. Something new. The Garden of Eden didn't cut it. The Promised Land didn't cut it. God has something bigger in mind this time, something that will surely work. If we read in Isaiah 11, here's how it's described, this new creation. The cow will feed the bear, their young will lie down together. The lion will eat straw like an ox, the infant will play near the cobra's den, and the young child will put its hand into the viper's nest. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Everyone will know God. And then it concludes with verse 10, which is here for you. In that day, the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for the people. The nations will rally to him, and his resting place will be glorious. Who are they talking about? Hundreds of years before he was born, but the root of Jesse is Christ himself. And what is his glorious resting place? But a tomb that would not remain closed for more than 3 days. This is the Easter story, foretold hundreds of years before Christ. You see, their story, it doesn't end well. There's no happy ending in the Old Testament. It just kind of ends. But there is hope. Throughout the entire Hebrew Scriptures, Israel never really realizes the dream to find this promised land. And by the time Jesus comes on the scene, we encounter God's chosen people living like exiles in their own homeland. They lived in their land, but who really owned it? Rome, Caesar. They served at the pleasure of Rome, and they weren't even allowed to crucify this pesky upstart from Galilee without first getting Pilate's permission. Now, this is sin. This is how they understood sin, which by definition means to miss the mark. They had an innate understanding that something was not right, that they were not quite right, that something had to change. And for them, sin did not exclude, but it was so much more than contravening some kind of personal or social moral code. It was a general sense that nothing was quite as it should be. Nothing was quite as it should be since Adam and Eve ate of that forbidden fruit. Sin, exile, a walking death. And then one day, around 30 A.D., John the Baptist, who was the last and the greatest of all the prophets, he starts a new chapter in Israel's history when he looks up and he sees someone coming and he says, "Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." This man, this Galilean carpenter's son, this Lamb of God, he's the key. He will fix things, free us from the walking death that is exile, give us a once and forever home, and set everything right once again. He will take away the sin of the world. And here's the great thing. He's going to do it in just 3 days. Now, next week, I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about how he does that. And I hope that you'll join us. Let's pray.